keep it short and sometimes I don't. But anyway, I'm going to hand over to Eamon, who's going to talk a little bit more, and then we'll hear from Alan. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. We, towards Understanding Healing, is really grateful that the Garden of Reflection has enabled us to programme this event. So that's the first thing. So we're really grateful, Susan. We're really grateful that you have come along. And we're really grateful that Alan has come along. We have, in Towards Understanding Healing, we've been talking about these kind of events where instead of what can happen, which is a discussion where people talk over each other, what we hope will happen today is that we will listen with the deepest of respect. Taya uses this beautiful phrase, the phrase being, listen with the ears of your heart. Listen with the ears of your heart. So that's what we're hoping will happen today. As Alan, who's travelled from Armagh to be with us today, shares his story. And the way we thought we would do this, and when I say we, I'm talking about the Management Committee of Towards Understanding and Healing, that includes Eamon Dean and Francis just here, and of course Maureen Hetherington and others, was that we would try to create situations where people could speak their truth, what it was like for them in the process of the Troubles, and that we would have designated witnesses here. And we have 3 here. One is just in this left corner here is James Greer. James Greer's looking around for himself. James, I've checked out how I might introduce James. James, in the 1970s, was a UDA prisoner, former loyalist prisoner, who for 30 years and more has been involved in peace building. We have Tony Callahan just here, who is police inspector, PSNI inspector, who has very graciously made time and may have to pop out to deal with some matters, but is one of the designated witnesses. And the third, and I'm delighted, Giles Dooley, who those who were at the conference last week, that included myself, spoke so beautifully, so inspirationally, and so enthusiastically about moving from beyond hurt into hope. So Giles and James and Tony, we're very, very grateful that you're here. That doesn't mean that they're the only people, as it were, who can respond to Alan. All of you are welcome to respond. All of us are special witnesses to what's happening today. So, with those words, can I hand you over to Alan? And I remember when we've done 2 of these before. One with Irene Kerrigan, and then the second with Donald Dunn. And it's always like then there's maybe like a space opens up. God, I'm on. So give a warm welcome to Alan Brecknell, who's travelled all the way from Armagh to be here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully I can live up to the expectation that seems to be around this event today. It's not that far actually to come from Armagh. I do it on a regular basis. I work with the Pat Finucane Centre at the minute, so obviously people in the city here will be fairly aware of the work the centre does here in the city, but I'll touch on the work that the centre does in Armagh later on. So as I say, it's a city I actually love coming to. I wasn't in Derry until probably about 12 years ago for the very first time. And as I say, it's a city I love coming up to. Quite lucky that Paul O'Connor, his wife, is Spanish. So they go away for 3 or 4 weeks of the summer, so it means that there's a free house in Derry, and it means that my family and myself can come up and spend time here as well, and I can spend time in my second favourite pub, which is Sandino's. My favourite pub is the Swan in Liverpool, which may get a mention later as well. So anyway, this is, as Eamon has said, this is my story. It's what has made me. It's the life that I've lived to date. So I suppose I'll start. My father, Trevor Brecknell, was born and bred in England, in Birmingham. My mother was Anne Mackin. She was born in Dorsey in South Armagh. She was one of 3 sisters who all ended up marrying Englishmen, which was something fairly unheard of in the late 60s in South Armagh anyway. My mother and father met on a blind date. My aunt Agnes was going out with Daddy's best friend, and I can always remember Mummy still would say to this day that she felt Daddy was a fairly arrogant man. I think she says that with love and compassion in her heart now at this stage. But I think what she meant by that was that he was a confident person. So anyway, they had a letter writing relationship for a while until Daddy come to live in Belfast. They got married in Belfast in 1967. I was born in September 1968. My brother was born in August 1969. Most people would class that as Irish twins. I suppose, I obviously don't remember much about those times. I can remember I starting school in St Bride's in Belfast, off the Dervolgy Road. I can remember being there for about a year or so. And then us packing everything into a sky blue transit van and moving up to Cullyhanna in South Armagh. Having spoke to my mother and since, she obviously fills in the gaps in relation to that part of our lives. In the summer of 1974, even though we lived in St Ives Gardens in Belfast, and whenever I tell this story, everyone looks at me, anyone who knows Belfast, that's one of the nicer parts of Belfast. Anyone I tell says, you were never put out of St Ives Gardens in Belfast. But unfortunately we were. There were 3 Catholic families left in the area, and a pipe bomb was left on the windowsill of one of the families. And the implicit threat was there that you need to leave as well. We had a decision to make, Mummy and Daddy obviously had that decision to make, whether to go to Birmingham or whether to go to South Armagh. My father had grown to love South Armagh, and especially during the time of the Ulster Workers' strike, seemingly because it was a haven. It was somewhere to get out of Belfast, which was a pretty nasty, volatile place at that time, so I'm led to believe. So we went to live in Cullyhanna. There had been new housing executive houses built at the time because we were not so politely asked to leave Belfast. We were given one of these houses. So as I say, that was the summer of 1974. Work was hard to come by for Daddy at that stage. He'd worked in Belfast, he'd worked in the Rolls-Royce factory, he'd worked as a postman, he'd worked as a fitter. He'd done lots of sort of different jobs. He seemed to be able to turn his hands to most things. But luckily, in early to mid-1975, he got a job in a local factory that would have made timbered windows and doors, but it started making aluminium windows and doors, and he turned his hand to that, and that's what he was. He was an aluminium manufacturer at that stage of his life anyway. He fitted in fairly well in life in Cullyhanna. He became a volunteer youth worker. To this day, I will still meet people maybe 4 or 5, 6 years older than me who say, God, I remember the time your dad was in the youth club, he was a great man. He also played darts for the local pub team. Again, I think that was just part of him learning to live in that society that he maybe wasn't part of. The other thing I remember really vividly about that time was there was these 2 wee boys from Belfast, myself and Mark, and no one understood a word we said. We had this Belfast accent. We went to school in September that year, and it was just, what? What are you saying? What did he say? What's that? So it was interesting times. I'll sort of move on now to Christmas 1975. The 17th of December, my sister Roisin was born. The 19th of December, Donnelly's bar in Silverbridge was attacked and 3 people were killed. Daddy was one of them. Himself and my Aunt Margaret, Mummy's sister, had been in to visit Roisin and Mummy obviously, and had come from our hospital. It was the last Friday before Christmas, and they'd gone in to have a celebratory drink with Daddy's workmates, wet the head of his first daughter. Margaret's husband John had travelled the whole way from Belfast at that stage, which wasn't an hour down the road as it is now, and arrived at the exact same time as those who come to attack the bar. They started shooting outside the bar, killing Patsy Donnelly, who was getting petrol. It was a bar, shop, petrol station, the whole lot. John, the car he had borrowed, his car hadn't been working. He'd borrowed a friend's car and the driver's door didn't open. So he had to climb across the seats and get out the passenger door. Probably saved his life because the person started shooting at him from the driver's side first and then realised he was getting out the other side. Luckily, John and Margaret both survived, but as I said, 3 people died. Daddy, Patsy Donnelly, and the 14-year-old son of the people who owned the bar, Michael Donnelly. Patsy and Michael weren't in any way related. On the same night, 3 hours before that, Kay's Tavern in Dundalk was blowing up. Hugh Waters and Jack Rooney lost their lives, and over 40 people were injured. 15 people were injured in Donnelly's that night. 1975 into the early 1976, there was a bloody end to the year and a bloody start to the following year. Seamus Mallon, not the politician obviously, was killed in a bomb attack in the Moy. Then on the last day of the year, Richard Beattie, William Scott and Sylvia McCulloch were killed in an ILNA bomb in Guildford. On the 4th of January, three members of the Reevy family, and 3 members of the O'Dowd family were killed. And then on the 5th of January, we had the King's Mill massacre, where 10 Protestant workmen were killed on their way home. I think I'm just mentioning that because it puts it in the context of what it was like mid-70s. And that's only what was happening in the area of the country that I come from. I'm sure if you look through lost lives, there were other deaths in both Derry, Belfast and the rest of the north. I think one thing that does strike me from that period of time is how the local community, like Cullyhan is a small village, there's about 200 homes in the whole parish, but the whole community gathered around ourselves. Patsy Donnelly's family lived in Cullerville, which is about 10 miles away. Michael Donnelly's family lived in Silverbridge, which is about 4 miles away, but the whole community come together in support of the families at that time. Margaret and John, as I said, my aunt and uncle who were seriously injured, came out of hospital and moved in with us, each with differing needs of care. John eventually went back to work. Unfortunately, Margaret, who had been a sister in the city hospital in Belfast, was never able to go back to work. She was shot in the head and had to be taught how to read and write all over again. She ended up for the last 6 years of her life with Alzheimer's, quite possibly brought on by the head injury. But there was also a new baby in the house. So you had 2 very sick and injured people, a new baby, a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old. And to be honest, I think that's what kept my mother going. She had so much to do, but she would now tell you that she doesn't remember the next 4 or 5 years of her life. For me, I suppose life moved on. Continued on in primary school. Made my first Holy Communion the following year. I was asked to do the first reading. It's a huge privilege, especially seeing I was probably the worst reader in the class. I'm not reading this, as you will tell. But it was a huge privilege, it was a huge event, it was a huge day for the family, I think. The other thing I remember about that particular year in school, and it's funny, Eamon reminded me of it earlier, I'd forgotten all about it, it sort of comes and goes to me. The school teacher, she was allegedly the most wicked school teacher in the school. At those times, corporal punishment was still allowed, and she would have picked you up by your ear. I was lucky, never happened to me. I don't know, maybe she took pity on me. But what I do remember about her is she rewarded you if you did anything good, if you got your spellings right, your sums right, if you got your first reading for First Holy Communion right, with midget jams. And to this day, I still love midget jams. So it's obviously a happy memory. I moved on then to school in St Joseph's in Crossmaglen, which again was a completely different experience. Cross Midland at that stage, and South Armagh, I suppose, it was probably the most militarised part of Western Europe. The school and the barracks in Cross Midland, police station, barracks, whichever terminology you like, are on the one road. It's a police station now, used to be a barracks.
Tony raises up.
Seen that? But they were on the one road, and the helicopters used to come in across the school and the housing developments, housing estates, into the barracks. It was obviously the safest route in. But what it did do was, well, for the first 6 months that I was at that school, completely distract me. But then again, it just becomes a background noise. It's like living beside an airport, I suppose. You sort of get used to it. During the time that I was at school in Cross, the barracks was attacked on a number of occasions with both mortar bombs and machine gun fire, and different helicopters were also attacked, even though they were flying in and out across over the housing developments in the schools. I moved on to the tech then in Newry and done a BTEC in construction. In the time that I was in Newry, that was probably one of my huge lasting memories. The RUC barracks in Newry was mortar bombed, killing 9 RUC personnel that day. I would normally have been away home by that stage, but there was a late class that I had to stay for, and it was one of the eeriest experiences of my life, I have to admit. I suppose the next period of my life is probably the happiest to date. I spent 5 years in Liverpool at the Poly. It is, in my opinion, humble opinion, one of the best cities in the world. I suppose it's my lived experience of it all the same. I maybe lived it too well in my first year. I failed my first year. Had to resit my exams and failed them, and I had to resit the whole year then. But it was a worthwhile experience, I have to admit. But it was also, it was a life-changing period of my life, because it got me away from Northern Ireland. It got me away from South Armagh. It got me away from all those influences. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those influences, but what it did do, it gave me the opportunity to experience new cultures, new people, new languages. I was there for 5 years, and I'll be perfectly honest with you, in that first year was really the first time that I'd had an opportunity to sit down and talk to someone from the Protestant community about their lived experience up to that particular time. That person was and is still a very, very good friend. It's important, I think, it was important from my point of view, maybe to have moved away. If I had stayed, I had the opportunity to go to Jordanstown to do civil engineering. I would have stayed within my own circle. I loved the GAA, I played Gaelic football, was lucky enough to represent Armagh at one stage in my life. I would have ended up in that circle. I would have ended up in that same culture and not learned about new experiences. And not just about here. I mean, there was people in my course from Indonesia, the Far East, the Middle East, and different parts of England, Scotland and Wales. So it was a huge experience. I think the thing about Liverpool from my point of view now is I try to go back at least every other year, because it was a life-changing experience, and I go back and I live those experiences again. Maybe that's because I want to be 18 or 19 all over again. But I'm only just back 2 weeks ago, and I have to admit, I was over there with my wife and brother-in-law and sister-in-law, and it was a great experience again, so it was, and I will always have fond memories of Liverpool. I suppose then the next period of my life is you come back home again, and like my father, whenever I came out with my degree in quantity surveying, but there was no construction work. I ended up working as a mushroom farmer, both growing and cutting and whatever all else you do with mushrooms. Keep them in the dark, isn't that what people say, and fill them full of whatever. But anyway, it was again, we had little money coming in, but Patricia and myself got married. Porrick, my eldest son, is now 18. If anyone's read the story in the book, I think he was 16 at that stage, maybe 17 whenever Eamon did the interview with me. But at the age of 3, he asked me, why do I not have a grandfather? And for me, that was a really difficult question to answer at that stage, because I hadn't asked myself the question, why do I not have a daddy? So I suppose that started the search for truth, justice, acknowledgement, whatever terminology you like to put to it. In around about the same time, probably about 6 or 8 months beforehand, an ex-RUC man called John Weir had given an affidavit in support of Sean McPhellamy's book, The Committee, which was banned here. But in it, he sort of laid out a series of attacks in basically what would have been known in the 70s as the murder triangle in counties Armagh, sort of East Tyrone, and maybe into South Armagh to an extent, where he said that members of the RUC and UDR were involved with loyalist paramilitaries in attacking individual families and Catholic bars. John Weir had been convicted of the sectarian murder of William Sathern in Ahaul in 1977. So I suppose from my point of view, he maybe knew what he was talking about. But I suppose it also started me on a journey as to, well, is what John Weir is saying true? Because one of the attacks he mentioned was the attack on Donnelly's bar. And he named 5 people as being involved in it. Excuse me. One of them was an RUC man and one of them was a UDR man. And I suppose that sort of, living in South Armagh, there was always that sort of suspicion that that was the case. But it was never really, no one wanted to talk to me about it. Why would you? Bring it back to me, bring it back to them, especially the people who were in the bar that particular night. But anyway, I asked a very close personal friend of mine if she knew of anyone who could help, and I was told that the Pat Finucane Centre in Derry did this sort of work. At that time I was a sales rep, so I was out and across basically the northern half of Ireland, because from Dublin across to Galway up was sort of my territory, so it was a pretty big territory to be driving around. So to drive 2 hours to Derry the day is very, very little, to be honest. But I come to Derry, come in at lunchtime one day and got speaking to, at that stage it was Paul O'Connor and Adrian Kerr who were working there. They had never heard of Donnelly's bar or the attack on Donnelly's bar, but they advised me that the best thing that we could do as a family was to document what had actually happened, pull together all the stories that we'd heard, look at all the newspaper articles that had been written, anything that had been written in books about it. I suppose to an extent that's still how the centre deals with new cases as they come through the door, which still happens to this day, to be honest. People still do come in with stuff that that is unfinished business in their lives. We then brought together everyone that was still alive that we could track down who was in the bar that night, or who helped in the aftermath of the attack, taking people to hospital, just clearing the rubble, helping to find people on the night who were buried in the rubble of the bombing, and took statements from them. The reasoning for this was to try and build up as big a picture as we possibly could. We then put an advert in the Belfast Telegraph to ask would the investigating officer come forward and talk to us. Jerry Donnelly, who owned the bar, and my mother both said that the investigating officer had come across to them as a decent, sound individual. So we thought, well, maybe he'll talk to us. And he did. He was still serving in the RUC at that stage. He's a chief superintendent. He was serving at headquarters in Knock. And his opening comment to us was that a member of the RUC and a member of the UDR were involved with loyalists from Portadown in the attack. No one had ever been convicted. This was his belief as the investigating officer. I have to admit this shocked us. It's not what we expected from a serving RUC man at the time. He then went on to say that permutations of the same gang were involved in other cases or other instances, and he listed 5 or 6 different attacks, one of them being the Dublin and Monaghan bombings. I suppose at that stage then, within the centre, people started, well, what does permutations of the same gang mean? And that started a huge piece of work, basically mapping the different attacks that happened in the area and see could they all be linked together or not linked together. And it wasn't a case of looking at every single attack that happened in the Armagh Tyrone area and saying, this is linked, this is linked. If it could be linked, it was linked. I suppose at the end of the day, what ended up happening out of this was there's a huge amount of research was done. There was probably somewhere in the region of about 120 deaths that could be attributed to this loose grouping of individuals, loyalists from Portadown, Dungannon and outside the Moy. And unfortunately, it is the case that there were members of the RUC and UDR also involved in that gang. We told the families at that time the only thing that we could promise them was to tell the story. And in October 2013, Anne Cadwallader's book, Lethal Allies, was the culmination of that piece of work and the telling of that story. One of the more recent events in my life was to be involved in the Victims and Survivors Forum. I have to admit this was a huge privilege for me, absolutely huge privilege to have been asked. But it was a difficult task. You were sat in a room with 27 other people who were classed as victims and survivors of the conflict, of the Troubles, all with different life experiences, all moulded by their own life experiences. I'm obviously moulded by mine and where I come from and who my family were and the community that I live in. Everyone else was the same. We all had our own baggage, if that's the way you want to put it. But what being on the forum did, I suppose it was a safe place to have difficult conversations. We were lucky we had that safe place. We had some great people who facilitated those early discussions. The 4 original commissioners did a great job at the start. Catherine Stone, whenever she was commissioner, did a great job as well. As I said, it was a privilege. But the role of the Victims and Survivors Forum was to provide or to give advice to the commissioner who would subsequently give that advice to OFM, DFM. Some of the advice was heeded and some of it wasn't. But I think if anyone was to go on the Victims Commission's website, some of the papers that were provided by the Victims and Survivors Forum are very, very useful documents. Some of the recommendations that come out of the recent Stormont House Agreement can be traced back, in my opinion, to some of the discussions we had. As I say, the forum has in the past done some sterling work. Unfortunately, I felt I had to resign from the forum about 3 months ago. I think it's lost its way. I think it's become too political. But I also think it's lost its way because of the lack of a strong advocate in a Victims Commissioner. And there's only one place that can be laid, and that's at the office of OFM, DFM. So I suppose in conclusion, my journey to date, in more recent times, in this last 10 or 12 years, it was a search for truth and justice. But then that begs the question, what does truth and justice look like? Truth and justice means different things to different people. To me, justice doesn't mean seeing someone in the dock for my father's murder. That's not what I want to see. It's 40 years ago this Christmas everyone who was involved in that attack is 40 years older, and hopefully 40 years wiser. People did things in the past that I'm sure they would never do again. I'm convinced of that. I'm convinced that this society has the capabilities to move on. I think the other point about it is the people who attacked the bar that night probably all have children or grandchildren. And this is how I look at it. Will it do me any good to wish to deprive a grandchild of the love of their grandparent? For me, the answer to that is no, because they can help shape the person, the grandchild, into a better person. I think we do need to understand and acknowledge our past, but we can't be trapped in the past. My mother often said to Roisin, Mark and myself, don't do this to anyone else. I suppose that's been my guiding light from that day. And in my mind, I suppose that's what I would want everyone else to go away with. Hopefully this place is moving towards that sort of sense of don't do this to anything else. It may be slow. We do hear about attacks on a regular basis, unfortunately, but I think this society can move forward. It will take leadership, and maybe not political leadership. I think it needs to come from the bottom up. So that's me, thank you.
It's been a great privilege to me to meet Alan. I recall that when I went up to Armagh to meet him, and he spoke to me, and he spoke to me about that horrific night in December 1975. I just sat and cried. So thank you so much for being here, and the eloquence with which you finished there, and how you see us moving beyond hurt, hopefully. So that really touches me as well. So I had said that we have Giles, and James and Tony, who one of the things they were asked to do is to be a special witness. That could include them being silent. When I was mentioning their names, I also left out Tracy. And part of what we hope will happen here is just as we approach 5 to 2, Tracy McGrory, just here, will play some piece of music that's improvised based on what she has been hearing, not only from Alan, but from all of us, as we attempt to create this ritual of truth-telling here today. So, and Tracy's told me that she plays easier stood up. So don't be thinking she's suddenly looking to steal the show or something. She just finds it easier to play in that way. So.
You didn't tell me that. I talk easier standing
It's too late now.
One of the things that really touched me when we were in the sandwich company just before we came in here was Alan was saying that he's an Aston Villa supporter, and it suddenly dawned on me, his daddy Trevor, Birmingham, Aston Villa. That little human detail touched me, and the humanness of this story. So I'm wondering, Tony, how you are with speaking, and it's okay not to, and the same with yourself, James, and the same with yourself, Giles. Just to lead us off, and I don't know, I don't have a watch on, so I'm not sure what time it is.
It's 22.
Coming 1:45, so we don't have a lot of time here. And I would exhort you to speak from the heart, rather than in that discussion mode that we're so familiar with, that often includes not listening to the other person. Not always, but often. Yeah.
Eamon, if I might start and say a few words, I'm a husband and father, and my wife says that actually I probably shouldn't today be able to listen with my heart, with those ears of your heart that you talked about, because I don't have a heart. Vain and selfish are my middle names, but I am hugely touched by listening to Alan this afternoon, humbled and enriched just listening to his story. hugely powerful story. For me, I suppose the overwhelming emotion that I'm feeling now is actually sadness. Sadness that people involved in Alan's story and throughout this island, this country, felt the need to do violence that was done to your father and to the people in the pub that night, and wider throughout society, literally thousands of deaths that were done in the name of one cause or another. And I had a discussion just before we came in with Eamon Callahan and Paul, and we discussed, do we as a society blame those folks involved? And there's something in what you've said today around actually, you're not looking for that justice in terms of a court, or do we look towards the thinking behind it, the ideology, the belief system that allowed us in this society to think that violence was a way to forward whatever cause or defend whatever cause. Sadness also, because I was a serving RUC officer and now a serving PSNI officer. The name of the RUC is dear to me, and to feel that sullied and blackened, if we're allowed to use that phrase any longer, because of stuff that's coming out now more and more, is hurtful and painful, because that's not the organisation that I joined, and not certainly what I joined for. I joined the RUC in 1986 and came to this city as my first station, and it was around making a change in our society, and a positive change. I hope I'm still trying to do that day and daily in my role as the local police commander here, but it is painful to hear that, and the truth of it is there for all to see. I think that it's hugely brave of you to talk about leaving aside that criminal justice piece and not looking for justice or truth through the courts, because the peeler in me says you deserve a day in court. The guy that pulled that trigger, the guy that threw that bomb, they need to be in front of a court somewhere to pay for those crimes. That's the peeler in me. The pragmatist, the person who thinks about these things, recognising absolutely what you say, that perhaps some line needs to be drawn under the past. Because where does it end? Where do we put a stop to that? And the pragmatist in me, the manager within the police service now, recognises that actually we probably couldn't do it. We couldn't fully investigate every crime, every murder, every attempted murder, every punishment, shooting, beating that went on through the late 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and probably into today as well. So, I absolutely get that. I think that I'll take an awful lot away from today, because you've probably changed my thinking a little bit today. You've helped me maybe just move my thinking from the cop in me wanting somebody standing in a dock in front of a judge, and actually hearing you as a victim saying what you've said today is hugely important. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Tony, thank you. And I know that you struggle with the term victim.
Yeah.
Yeah. Victim, survivor.
Yeah, even struggle with survivor.
Yeah.
I think they're two very, very loaded terms.
Yeah.
I also think, well, I say this because it's going on the internet, some of the victims groups in this society aren't actually doing the good work that they're supposed to be doing. I think every victims group in this society should be striving to put themselves out of work. And that's not actually happening.
That's a good point.
thank you again. Giles, do you want
Well, I mean, obviously, I just want to start by thanking you for sharing the story. I purposely, we discussed this earlier, that I had your story in the book and chose not to read it because I wanted to hear it from you and not to kind of go in with any ideas about how I was going to react to the story or what I was going to think. In many ways, my job is to witness stories. I travel around the world listening to stories about people affected by conflict around the world. And most specifically, I'm interested in what I call the ripples of conflict. That the one event, it's the effect that then is passed on to the people around it. That when somebody is killed in a conflict, it's the family, the friends that bear that. And in my own personal experience, when I was injured, it really brought it home because I had, in some ways, selfishly gone to places thinking, something happens to me, it happens to me, I'm just doing my job. And then I saw the effect that my injury had on the people around me and how, as I say, that one event, that pebble creates all those ripples. But what really, I kind of wanted to say, as I said, the thoughts are still forming in my head, but when I was in Afghanistan the last time, I remember feeling real shame about my country. Because in Afghanistan, and I'm not talking about the rights and wrongs of the war, that's not what I'm talking about right now, but I'm talking about accountability for the people involved with it. And so you'll see some photographs here that I took of children injured in Afghanistan. And the reality is some of those weapons came from my country. And what shamed me was the amount of people I would speak to in my country, and Afghanistan, they're like, there's nothing to do with us. Or if they were interested, they would say, it's the government, it's nothing, the government is their plot to do this, it's nothing to do with me. And my shame in that is the lack of accountability, because I help fund those weapons. My tax money goes there. And I vote in a democracy that chose to go to those conflicts. And so, my work in many ways is to return that accountability, to bring back those stories to my country and say, look, we are involved in this. And I'd say my shame is that the majority of people are not affected by something that we have helped happen, and a villager has died because of a bomb dropped that we have helped fund, that our government has allowed to happen. And I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong, but I'm saying, how can you not feel accountable? How can you not be doing your research and wanting to know what's going on? How is it that in the election right now, there is no talk about conflicts that are going on? It's not even an issue in the current debate. And my shame is that people in my country are not even interested enough to find out about a country we're bombing. We're involved in a conflict there. Now, going back, then, as a child, I grew up very aware of the Troubles. It was something that affected us, but as a ripple. It was something that affected people close to me very directly. But the same feeling, I think, was there, that really had nothing to do with us. That it wasn't something that we were directly involved with. So what I got today was that same sort of shame that I had in Afghanistan, that people in my country weren't that interested in what was happening in Afghanistan, despite us funding those weapons. And so I had that same sense. I was a child and I didn't know enough to look into it. But speaking as a kind of collective, not that I speak for my whole country, but but speaking as a collective, it's that shame that, again, I'm not talking about the rights or wrongs, but I am saying the neglect and the lack of accountability to say we are involved with this, we should know both sides of the story. And so that is the sense I got from today.
It's rare that I would be speechless.
A chorus of laughter there, James.
I know those that know, know that I've never stuck for something to say, but I read your story. Unlike Jags, I thought I would come here prepared. A couple of things struck me. You were on the bus for Liverpool when you got the offer of the other university. maybe not exactly, that's not exactly the way, but that's the way my mind's seen it. And you decided to go to Liverpool, you know. And what I read in your story was that it was your saviour, you know. And I don't think you consciously broke away from your culture, but you certainly found yourself exposed to more cultures. And I, you know, unfortunately, and I don't appreciate your comment on morals, you know, because that's not, I don't think that's appropriate. I think I was brought up with a high sense of morality, and maybe the high sense of morality that I was brought up with was my downfall. You know, I was brought up in a community pretty much like your own, and pretty much like lots of Ulster communities, parochial communities that were only inward looking, you know, and only understood each other and their own feelings, if at all. So the tide that carried me, you know, carried me right into the arms of paramilitaries, you know, and the tide that carried you was potentially, you know, at what age were you, 18?
Whenever I went to Liverpool.
17 or 18, whatever, you know. Maybe the die was cast and you weren't going to be involved, I don't know. But I have regretted every day since the choices that I made, the ill-informed choices that I made at that age, you know, and I congratulate you, you know, from every fibre of my body and all my heart on the choices that you made and the way you can sit there and reflect on your life and your circumstances. You know, you're a special kind of person. I'll tell you this.
I just want to say one thing on that, and I alluded to it. It's not just down to me. It was down to the strong nature and character of my mother.
Your mother, I know. I was getting there because your mother, you know, fought, you know, losing her husband, and initially probably suffered with terrible shock and loss, but managed that Christmas, I believe, to try and normalise your lives. You know, your father was killed on the 19th, and by the 25th or the 24th, your mother had decided, let's create some kind of normality for these kids. We can't bring their daddy back, but we can, you know, make this as normal as we can for them. The other thing, and when I could rant and rave on about that for hours, the other thing was, you know, that you alluded to was that, you know, being part of the solution, part of the problem and part of the solution, and your lack of desire to see revenge, you know, and I think at this point, you know, and I was just reading a story online yesterday about a guy, a Nazi called Oscar Groney, and Oscar's 91, I think. You know, he was a clerk in Auschwitz. All right, he was on Auschwitz, he was a clerk, but you know, he was put there to do a job. He was a pen pusher, and now through some act of revenge, it could only be revenge because they knew about him for many. He was actually a magistrate, so they knew about him for many years. You know, and what you're saying is, you know, set your emotions to one side, set your desire for revenge to one side, and say, what is the point of prosecuting men who have children and grandchildren and are in their 70s? You know, and that for me, you know, and I have terrible difficulty with forgiveness, you know, but your act, that is one of the most magnanimous things that I've ever done. Thanks.
James, thank you. Thank you. My guess is that many people would want to get involved here and talk, and yet we're going to close this off now because we're almost at 2 o'clock, and we've invited Tracy to, and Tracy, this was Tracy's idea that she would improvise rather than us suggesting that she improvise. So Tracy McGrory.
Yeah, it's I suppose not an easier thing. I could have come in, would have been easier just to to play a tune and have one prepared, but I suppose what hearing is words like choices and ripples and effect, and how not it only affect you but the strength of your mother and all of them things. So somehow I'd like to include all of that if possible. I've just called the piece Ripples, and there's hope as well.
Also left out, Jim O'Neill here is on the management committee of Towards Understanding and Healing, so I omitted to say that earlier. Can we give our thanks to Alan Brecknell, who's only come down down the road? I'm guessing Alan will be here for a little while if you want to have a wee quiet conversation with him. Thank you so much for being here. This could not happen without you.
Thank you, Eamon, as well. Just, you know, Eamon, it's been these particular sessions that we do occasionally are really important, you know, in the grand scheme of things, but they're important for us too, just as a community that, you know, here to hear other people's stories. And thank you for facilitating that, you know. I mean, we just provide the vehicle and we're more than happy to, and it really fits in well with everything. And, you know, again, it's just wonderful to see so many people and everybody listened with the ears of their heart, I think, very much. Alan, thank you so much. We'll close it there, and I think thank you very much for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.